The frightening discovery was not that Anne had forgotten. It was what she had forgotten. Weddings remained. Funerals remained. Childhood remained. Duty remained. Yet several private conversations, family confrontations, and decisions surrounding the final years of Elizabeth's reign seemed to exist only as fragments, and that changed everything. Anne did what she had always done when something refused to make sense. She began working through it methodically. Diaries were reopened. Old schedules were compared. Correspondence was reread. She quietly asked staff members about conversations they remembered, then tested those accounts against her own fractured recollections. At first, the exercise seemed almost reassuring. She could remember routine engagements with remarkable clarity. She knew where she had been, whom she had met, what duties had been completed. But the closer she moved toward emotionally charged moments, the more unstable everything became. That was what frightened her. Ceremonies remained intact. Family pressure did not. Ordinary meetings survived in detail, while private arguments over inheritance, personal papers, and jewelry seemed blurred around the edges. Anne began wondering why her mind had preserved the mechanical parts of royal life but allowed the most important emotional moments to collapse into fragments. The pattern was too specific to dismiss. One gap troubled her more than the others. It involved discussions about what should happen to certain possessions after Elizabeth's death. Some were valuable. Others carried meaning that could never be measured in money. Letters, personal instructions, jewelry, private objects tied to relationships and memories. Anne had apparently known more than most because Elizabeth trusted her discretion. That trust had always been presented as a compliment. Now it began to feel like a burden. Anne had been expected to hold information without leaking it, dramatizing it, or seeking sympathy. She was not merely Elizabeth's daughter in those conversations. She was a guardian, a witness, someone expected to remember what others preferred never to discuss publicly. Charles had long valued that quality in her. Anne's silence protected the institution because people knew she would not turn private tensions into public weapons. But silence had a cost. William began asking a question Anne did not want to hear. What if these gaps were not simply the result of exhaustion? What if years of swallowing grief, anger, family conflict, and responsibility had done something deeper? Anne rejected the idea immediately. Duty had defined her for too long. To admit that duty itself had wounded her felt almost like betraying everything she had spent decades defending. Then, during one conversation, a sentence returned without warning. Some things should remain within the family. Elizabeth's voice. Elizabeth's instruction. Anne stopped. The words did not arrive alone. They pulled something else behind them, the sense of weight in her hands, the memory of being trusted with something specific, and the sudden certainty that one of the missing periods was connected directly to her mother. And when Anne finally remembered what her mother had placed in her hands, the mystery stopped being only about memory. It became a question of inheritance, loyalty, and a secret nobody had wanted reopened. Anne had never needed a crown to hold power inside the family. Elizabeth trusted her precisely because she did not appear to want anything. That was why, according to the story, Anne was slowly recovering. The Queen had given her responsibility for something far more dangerous than a title. The memories did not return cleanly. They came in pieces. A private conversation. A folded letter. A quiet instruction spoken without witnesses. Anne began to remember that Elizabeth had asked her to help protect certain family matters that existed beyond the normal machinery of royal inheritance. These were not simply assets to be recorded and distributed. They carried emotion, history, old wounds, and promises that could not be explained by paperwork alone. There were letters, personal instructions, sentimental objects, jewelry whose official ownership might have seemed simple, yet whose meaning was anything but. Elizabeth understood that after her death, those objects could become symbols. A brooch could suggest favor. A necklace could imply approval. A tiara could be interpreted as a statement about rank, continuity, or who truly belonged at the center of the monarchy. That was why Anne mattered. She understood the difference between value and meaning. A jewel could be worth millions and still be less dangerous than a smaller piece attached to a painful memory. And one particular jewel stood above the rest, not because it was the grandest, but because several royal women were connected to its story. Whoever wore it next would not simply be wearing jewelry. They would be inheriting an argument. Anne remembered Elizabeth being unusually clear about that point. The piece was not to be used to manufacture authority. It was not to become a shortcut for rewriting the past. That instruction immediately placed Anne in an impossible position after Elizabeth's death. Charles was now king. Camilla occupied a new and powerful place beside him. William represented the future. And behind all of them stood the emotional legacy of women whose stories could not simply be rearranged to make the new reign more comfortable. When attempts were made to simplify those old instructions, Anne resisted. She insisted that Elizabeth's private wishes mattered precisely because they were inconvenient. That resistance changed how some people saw her. She was no longer simply the dependable sister who kept things moving. She had become an obstacle. And obstacles create pressure. Then another fragment returned. Elizabeth's voice. Calm, almost resigned. She had warned Anne that loyalty sometimes meant disappointing everyone at once. Anne finally understood why those words had stayed with her for months after the Queen's death. She had been expected to protect a promise without explaining it, defend a decision without exposing its source, and absorb the resentment that followed. And then, somehow, the sharpest parts of those months had begun to disappear. Yet Elizabeth's secret instructions were only part of the burden, because Anne's next returning memory involved a confrontation so painful that even she had apparently spent years refusing to name what it had done to her. Anne did not remember shouting. She remembered the silence after it. A closed room. Familiar voices suddenly cautious. A royal object sitting between them, like evidence. And one sentence aimed directly at her loyalty, a sentence that returned without warning and left her visibly shaken. The memory came back in fragments, but enough survived to expose what had happened. It was a private family meeting after Elizabeth's death, when grief was still fresh and the new reign was trying to define itself. The discussion had begun with inheritance, ceremonial continuity, and the future use of certain royal possessions. On the surface, it sounded practical. Underneath, it was a fight over who had the right to decide what the past now meant. Some believed objects connected to earlier royal women should simply move forward with the monarchy. New reign, new responsibilities, new public meaning. Anne resisted that idea. She knew Elizabeth had attached personal wishes to some of those objects, and she believed ignoring those wishes would turn continuity into something colder. To Anne, history was not a costume that could be reassigned whenever the institution needed a cleaner story. That position made her difficult. Someone accused her of guarding a version of the past the monarchy could no longer afford to remain trapped inside. Anne's answer was immediate. Continuity did not mean rewriting history for convenience. But the argument changed when the challenge became personal. One voice questioned whether Anne was truly defending Elizabeth's instructions or whether grief had altered the way she remembered them. That cut deeper than anyone in the room may have realized. Anne had built her entire place in the family around reliability. She remembered. She kept promises. She did not exaggerate. She did not turn emotion into spectacle. If that reliability could be questioned, then everything she was trying to protect suddenly became vulnerable. And for the first time, Anne began doubting herself. If the others remembered the conversation differently, could she be wrong? Had grief changed something? Had she held too tightly to words spoken in private because letting them go felt like losing Elizabeth again? The doubt became corrosive. Instead of continuing the argument, Anne withdrew from it. She spoke less about the disputed instructions and worked more. Engagements, duties, travel, responsibility, almost as if relentless motion could silence uncertainty. But the opposite happened. Whenever Elizabeth's final wishes were mentioned, Anne's recall seemed to become less stable. Details blurred. Conversations broke apart. The very subject she needed most to remember became the one her mind resisted hardest. William would later learn that the confrontation had been far harsher than the softened version he first heard. And that forced him to confront an uncomfortable possibility. The family had relied on Anne's strength so completely that nobody noticed when she was left carrying the damage alone. But Anne's tears finally came when she admitted that the argument had not been the moment she lost control, it had been the moment she decided she was no longer allowed to show that she had been hurt. For decades, Anne's strength had looked almost invincible. She worked, endured, buried irritation, accepted criticism, and kept moving. But strength can become its own prison, and when Anne finally explained what she had done after Elizabeth died, the family began seeing her discipline in a completely different way. Her response to grief had been almost mechanical. She did not slow down. She accelerated. More engagements, more travel, more family obligations, more reasons not to sit quietly with what had happened. Motion felt safer than reflection, because reflection opened doors Anne was not ready to walk through. As long as there was another duty waiting, she could convince herself she was coping. The family admired her for it. They praised her stamina, her reliability, her refusal to collapse under pressure. Nobody realized that every compliment was reinforcing the same instinct that kept her from confronting what she was carrying. Anne had spent too much of her life being the sibling who did not need rescuing. Asking for help would have felt like stepping out of character. Worse, it might have given others another reason to question her judgment about Elizabeth's final wishes. So, she buried more than grief. She buried anger. Anger at being trusted with secrets, but expected to pretend they were weightless. Anger at being told to protect private instructions while absorbing the suspicion that came with defending them. Anger at herself for caring so deeply about promises she could not openly explain. That was why the tears finally came with such force. They were not attached to one missing conversation. They came from a more frightening realization: Anne could no longer completely trust the internal archive she had depended upon all her life. The woman famous for remembering obligations, names, details, and promises was suddenly unsure which parts of her own history were secure. And yet, something unexpected began happening. The harder Anne tried to force certain memories back, the further away they seemed. But when she stopped fighting, fragments returned. A phrase, a location, a decision. It suggested that the missing pieces were tangled with the very emotional pressure she had spent years refusing to acknowledge. Charles was shaken by that confession. It forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth about the monarchy itself. The institution celebrated endurance. It rewarded people who continued without complaint. But rarely did anyone ask what that endurance was costing beneath the surface. William saw something even darker. Anne had become a human vault for the family, trusted because she could hold what others could not. Nobody had considered what might happen if the vault itself began to fracture. Then, one memory returned with startling clarity. Anne remembered moving something. Not a letter, not a file. One of the disputed royal objects. She remembered doing it shortly after Elizabeth's death, quietly and deliberately, because she believed leaving it where it was created a risk. And once Anne remembered where she had taken it, the family faced a far more uncomfortable question. What had Elizabeth feared badly enough to make her daughter hide it in the first place? It was not the jewel's price that frightened Elizabeth. It was its meaning. Worn by the wrong person, at the wrong moment, it could be interpreted as approval, succession, forgiveness, even conquest. And Anne now remembered exactly why her mother had refused to leave that symbolism to chance. The piece had been treated differently from the beginning. Elizabeth had apparently separated it from the ordinary flow of royal jewelry, not because it lacked a clear owner, but because its history was too emotionally loaded to be handled like any other object. It had been connected, directly or symbolically, to more than one royal woman. That made every future appearance dangerous. The moment it was worn again, people would ask what it meant. Was it continuity? Acceptance? Replacement? Elizabeth understood how quickly a private object could become a public declaration. A jewel could say something the wearer never intended. Worse, it could appear to rewrite relationships that had been complicated, painful, or unresolved. Anne remembered her mother being firm about one point. Rank alone should never decide the future of something carrying that much emotional history. That instruction became far more difficult after Elizabeth's death. The new reign needed symbols of stability. Familiar jewels, old traditions, and visible links to the past could reassure the public that the monarchy remained continuous even after such a profound loss. Pressure grew to clarify who could wear what and when. To some, the disputed piece was simply part of that process. Anne saw it differently. She believed using it too quickly would turn a deeply personal object into political theater. So while discussions continued, she quietly arranged for the jewel to be placed under more restricted custody. It was not hidden in the sense of disappearing. It was protected from casual access until Elizabeth's intentions could be respected. That decision would later become part of the argument Anne had struggled to remember. Charles was stunned when the full explanation returned, not because he had been completely unaware of the object's location, but because he had never understood the warning Elizabeth had attached to it. Suddenly, the dispute looked different. Anne had not been resisting the new reign for the sake of resistance. She believed she was obeying something personal, but that created an even more dangerous question. Was Elizabeth protecting the legacy of one woman? Was she trying to prevent another from gaining symbolic authority through the peace? Or was she simply trying to stop an old family wound from being turned into a new public message? Anne could not answer without revealing conversations Elizabeth had expected her to keep private, and that was the trap. Her memory problems had begun intensifying soon after she became the only person defending an instruction she could not easily prove. To explain herself meant breaking confidence. To remain silent meant allowing others to doubt her. But the jewel was still not the truth that stunned the family most, because Anne was beginning to remember that Elizabeth's final warning had never truly been about diamonds at all. The words returned slowly, then all at once. Elizabeth had spoken about the jewel, but her real fear was larger. She believed objects became dangerous when people used them to settle emotional debts. And according to Anne's recovered memory, the Queen had seen those debts building inside her own family. Anne began to understand that her mother had never been talking only about diamonds. Elizabeth had worried about what would happen when her presence was gone, and old tensions no longer had to remain contained around her. Inheritance could expose feelings people had hidden for years. A residence could become proof of favor. A title could feel like acceptance. A letter could reopen an old wound. Even access to a particular jewel could be interpreted as forgiveness, approval, or victory. That was why Anne had been trusted with more than objects. Her role had been to separate private emotion from public rank whenever possible. Elizabeth knew that the monarchy survived through symbols, but she also knew symbols could become weapons inside a family. Anne now realized she had been guarding her mother's attempt to stop private resentments from becoming public battles over legacy. That realization unsettled Charles. It suggested Elizabeth had expected tension after her death. Not necessarily open rebellion, but something quieter and more dangerous, different people attaching different meanings to the same inheritance, each convinced that possession proved something about their place in the family. William felt the weight of that immediately. Anything connected to Diana, Elizabeth, or the future monarchy carried more than financial value. These objects belonged to memory, and memory was emotional territory. One decision about who wore what could reopen arguments no formal rule had ever truly settled. For Anne, the position had become impossible. If she revealed Elizabeth's private conversations, she betrayed the confidence her mother had placed in her. If she stayed silent, she looked rigid, controlling, even unreasonable. She had chosen silence because loyalty demanded it. But silence left her alone with accusations she could never completely answer. Now the damage of that choice became clearer. Anne had been pulled in every direction at once. Daughter to Elizabeth, sister to Charles, aunt to William, servant to the crown. Each role demanded a different kind of loyalty, and sometimes those loyalties collided. For years, she had treated that conflict as something to endure rather than something allowed to hurt. But she could no longer call what was happening a simple personal failure. The missing memories, the emotional blocks, the tears she had fought so hard to contain. They were all forcing one admission she had resisted for decades. Refusing vulnerability had not made the burden disappear. It had only made it easier for everyone, including Anne, to pretend the burden was harmless. And there was still one memory left. Not about the jewel. Not about inheritance. About Anne herself. And when Anne revealed those final words, the room reportedly fell silent, because Elizabeth had understood her daughter's greatest weakness long before Anne was willing to admit it. Elizabeth's final warning to Anne was not about duty, jewels, Charles, or the future crown. It was about Anne. She had watched her daughter spend a lifetime becoming the person everyone leaned on, and she feared that one day the weight would remain even after Anne's strength began to fail. Anne remembered the meaning of those words more clearly than the exact moment they were spoken. Elizabeth had understood something her daughter refused to admit. Loyalty without limits could become self-destruction. No one person, however disciplined, could carry grief, family secrets, disputed instructions, old resentments, and the expectations of an institution forever. But Anne had spent so many years proving she could endure almost anything that endurance had stopped being a choice. It had become her identity. At the time, she dismissed the warning. Then Elizabeth died, and Anne did exactly what her mother had feared. She carried everything. The grief, the private promises, the tension over inheritance, the arguments about legacy, the responsibility of defending instructions she could not openly explain. She kept moving, because stopping would have meant feeling the full weight of it. Now she could no longer escape what that had cost. The tears came because the missing memories finally made sense to her. She was not simply frightened by what she could not remember. She was devastated by the possibility that those memories had become unbearable because she had never given herself permission to process them. For years, she had treated emotion as something to contain. Now, the very things she had buried were returning in fragments. Charles was shaken by the realization. Anne's reliability had made it easy to assume she needed less from everyone else. Less reassurance, less protection, less explanation. She was always the one expected to cope. And that expectation had quietly become its own form of neglect. William saw the warning reaching beyond Anne. If the next generation of the monarchy learned only how to suppress fear, grief, anger, and doubt beneath duty, then the same damage could repeat itself under different names. Even the disputed jewel now seemed smaller. It had never truly been the prize. It was a symbol of everything Anne had been asked to protect alone. The real inheritance Elizabeth had left her was trust, and trust had become a burden when nobody else was allowed to share it. Anne did not walk away from duty. She never could. But she changed its terms. Information would be shared. Sensitive instructions would be recorded more clearly. Decisions would no longer depend entirely on one person's memory or silence. Some of Anne's lost memories might never fully return. Yet their consequences already had. And perhaps that was the cruelest irony of all. The woman so often treated as one of the monarchy's strongest figures had not been nearly undone by scandal, rebellion, or humiliation. She had been worn down by spending decades convincing everyone, including herself, that she could never break. And perhaps that was the truth that stunned the royal family most. Princess Anne had not forgotten. Because she stopped caring, she had carried too much. For too long. In silence.